Natural disasters, hurricanes specifically, they're terrifying. They're uncontrollable, unpredictable, and those in their paths are at the mercy of the way the wind blows. They can create massive destruction, debris, and knock out power in entire cities and across states. But in this case, a major hurricane becomes a giant obstacle in the way of investigating a double homicide, giving a chance for the killer to get away as the storm rages. Hi, everyone. Welcome to 38 of the Darklivity podcast. I'm your host, Kimberlea, and I'm here with the man of many titles, editor, podcast co-host, love of my life, Jonathan.
Hi. Darklivity. It's the dark downward slope into the degradation of the human mind and the consequences that such darkness bring to light.
I can't believe it's almost our 40th episode now. And we're so close to 80,000 subscribers. And then we might get that, big, shiny play button from YouTube for 100,000, which is all because of you. So we want to thank you so very much. I also didn't realize that y'all like to order those cameos. We just did a cameo for someone's birthday, and I just did one a few weeks ago for someone else's birthday. And if you don't know what they are, they're these little, what are they called? Videos that you can customize and request. And thank you for doing that. I didn't even know people knew I had a cameo because I never really promote it. But there you go. And I've also done probably about 10 more thank yous for the Darklivity merch. So thank you so very much. Those little videos should go right to your email, whatever email you ordered your merch on. Today's case was chosen because it's another one from my home state of Florida. And because lately there have been massive hurricanes barreling down in the South, destroying so much and impacting so many lives. I was actually there to witness my fair share of hurricanes, including the one that we'll be highlighting in this case today, which is Hurricane Andrew. So please, if you do have your own hurricane experience, tell us in the comments. John, have you ever been in a hurricane?
Not a hurricane, but I was miles away from the Northridge quake near Los Angeles, hitting a 6.7 near where I lived.
Wow.
Yeah, definitely shook some stuff.
I've been in a few earthquakes, but none of them have been, thankfully, very bad because it's terrifying. Hurricanes are also equally terrifying, but mostly it's because of the pandemonium that occurs before the storm that scares and stresses out so many people. They're fighting over things like water, toilet paper, necessities, and the store shelves are bare. Gasoline's gone. People are going crazy. They're boarding up their homes, their windows, trying to protect their prized possessions, or even hurrying to flee the area altogether. Before we get into the year that Andrew hit the coast of South Florida, let's go back in time and introduce you to Rita Ann Tabicio. She was raised in Torrington, Connecticut to parents George and Mary, and she had two brothers, Thomas and Richard. After graduating from school, Rita married James Bado. And Rita and James had two children, their son Alan and their daughter Lisa Ann, born on July 2nd, 1972. Rita embraced motherhood wholeheartedly. She found so much joy and fulfillment in raising her children. She chose to stay at home during their formative years, investing her time and energy and love into guiding Alan and Lisa as they grew up. To the kids, Rita was more than just their mother. She was their most dedicated champion, always encouraging and supporting them in all their endeavors. However, as Alan and Lisa moved into their school years, Rita found herself sitting around alone with the emptiness of a quiet house. And to fill that void, she decided to step back into the working world and accepted a position as a school bus driver for a local company. And that's a pretty unique job, I'd have to say, and also a challenging one. At least nowadays, kids can be crazy on those buses. But Rita was excited, and this new chapter in her life provided her with a renewed sense of purpose and brought an unexpected sense of joy. She dedicated the next decade to her role, treating her job not just as a profession, but as a meaningful extension of her love for children. And she felt that she was truly helping them as she got them to school safely and helped busy parents by ensuring their kids had a safe and reliable mode of transportation. Not everyone loves their job, but Rita truly did. She enjoyed every interaction that she had with the students, getting to know them personally and taking pride in witnessing them growing up over time. The bonds that she built with her young passengers and the respect that she earned from her coworkers made her a memorable person in their lives. But for Rita, being a mother was always her primary calling.
Now that you know more about Rita, I want to tell you more about her daughter Lisa. Back in high school in Torrington, she took up tennis and was super passionate about it during her sophomore and junior years. Even though she gave it her all, the competition was fierce and she felt just short in the championship matches both years. But Lisa was never one to back down. She set her sights on making her senior year the game changer. During her final year, Lisa's dedication to tennis intensified. She poured endless hours in the practice, perfecting her technique and pushing herself to the limit. And all that hard work finally paid off. She finally won the championship title, and it was the sweetest victory after all those close calls. But as amazing as she was at tennis, Lisa's true love was baking. She had a special knack for turning basic ingredients into mouth-watering treats, and would often surprise her friends and family with her creations. Deep down, she dreamed of becoming a pastry chef one day.
I don't hear that a lot, but then again, everyone on Instagram at least, and maybe TikTok, is making everything into cakes. And these days, those videos kind of scare me. They'll be like in their bathroom and pretend they're shaving their leg, and then their leg is a cake. Have you seen those? It's weird. I just saw a full life-size cake of Taylor Swift. I'm going to put it up here if we can find it. I don't know how I feel about something like that. It's kind of strange. You're like eating someone's body.
Yeah, I've seen those realistic heads getting
Ew.
cut open and it's cake. Oh my God.
I just saw those. It's so weird. And they have like imperfections on their face and like facial hair. And then all of a sudden you see like a knife just I don't know. That's strange. But Lisa was definitely very talented.
She was. Lisa's dream wasn't just becoming a pastry chef, though. She wanted to work on cruise ships, traveling across the globe, and creating these beautiful desserts for guests while being surrounded by the sparkling ocean. She loved the idea of meeting people from all different backgrounds and cultures. But that wasn't all. Lisa also dreamed of owning her own bakery someday. She wanted a place where she could not only showcase her talent and share the creations with everyone who stepped through the door, but also train others, passing on her passion and expertise to aspiring bakers.
Lisa was more than just athletic and driven. She had an undeniable charm about her as well. She was very beautiful with sparkling blue eyes, tan skin from playing so much tennis, and long blonde hair. She was beautiful on the outside, but she also had a great personality. But she wasn't a really loud, outgoing, in-your-face type of person. She was more reserved and shy. It took her a little while to come out of her shell. She was always very positive, though, seeing the best in every situation and also seeing the best in people. So, of course, with these qualities, Lisa had no trouble making a lot of friends in high school, but there was one bond that stood out above all: her relationship with her mom, Rita. Theirs was far from the usual mother-daughter dynamic. They were more like best friends. They shared an unbreakable connection, rooted in deep love, and it wasn't just Lisa that felt like her mom was her best friend. Her brother Alan also called Rita his best friend. She was the kids' biggest fan, always showing up to support them, listen to them, and guide them with love and understanding. Rita was Lisa's confidant, who she trusted the most.
As Lisa's high school days were wrapping up in 1991, things at home were changing a lot. Rita, after 22 years of marriage, made the difficult decision to divorce James. It wasn't easy, but she felt that it was the right thing to do. After the split, Rita had to figure out her new life, juggling the challenges of being a single mom while working 2 jobs. On top of her decade-long job as a school bus driver, Rita also started working as a clerk at a local convenience store to make ends meet. Meanwhile, Lisa's brother Alan was already on his own path, serving in the military, which added another layer to their family dynamic. Rita had to handle all these changes mostly by herself. Even with all the responsibilities weighing on her, she still stayed strong and made sure to be there for her kids. A lot of her strength came from the bond she shared with Lisa. Rita didn't want her daughter to see her fail.
And isn't that so common as parents? We want our children to almost see us like superheroes. We don't want to let them down, but we're human. And I can relate to Rita. We do so much because of our kids.
We do, but don't forget, it's important to take time for ourselves.
Yeah, that's definitely important.
The divorce had a big impact on Rita. It made her want to leave Torrington, Connecticut and start somewhere fresh and new. But the one thing keeping her rooted was Lisa. Even though Lisa was an adult, Rita couldn't picture just leaving her behind.
Yeah, that's a tough choice. Rita wanted to move on and get away from everything that tied her to the memories of her failed marriage, but she had a beautiful gift from that situation: her kids.
Since Lisa and Rita shared everything, Rita confided in her about the plan to move. And thankfully, Lisa was on the same page and open to the idea of change. She often dreamed of living somewhere with warm weather where she could swim and play tennis all year round.
And speaking of warm weather, Rita's brother Thomas, he and his wife Karen had recently moved to Boynton Beach, Florida, and their newfound happiness and excitement about life caught Rita's attention. Seeing them so content with the beautiful weather, it seemed like they were on a vacation all year round, and it planted a seed in Rita's mind and gave her this inspiration she needed to consider making a change for herself and her daughter Lisa. I've lived in Boynton Beach, and it is beautiful. And in case you don't know anything about Torrington, Connecticut, because I didn't, Torrington has cold winters, and I mean, I'm sure it's great that you get the experience of all 4 seasons, but people can get really sick of the cold. It also has a pretty small town feel to it, unlike a place like South Florida that's very touristy and busy with lots to do.
Once Rita had Lisa on board, the two of them started looking into different cities in South Florida. They wanted to be close enough to Rita's brother Thomas, but also needed a spot that was affordable and had a place for Lisa to play tennis. Eventually, they narrowed it down to an area near West Palm Beach called Lantana.
I can't say that I've ever lived in Lantana, but I have lived in West Palm Beach, and Lantana is between Boynton Beach, where Rita's brother was and his wife lived, and just south of West Palm Beach. It's also on the coast, so you get the sandy beaches, the laid-back vacation atmosphere year-round, and it's almost always warm and sunny. Palm Beach County was my home for many, many years. The sprawling estates, the gorgeous beaches, multi-million-dollar homes on the water. That's what most people think about when they think of Florida. But then there's the other side of Florida. And you probably know what I'm talking about. The memes about like the Florida man, or this only happens in Florida. Other times we think of things like Epstein Island when we think of Palm Beach. And unfortunately, I did go to college right across the bridge from Epstein Island. Florida is a place where a lot of tourists flock during the summer months, and hundreds of people come there, not only to party, but also to escape from wherever they're living and come for the sun and the fun and a better life. So it's more transient, and Lisa and Rita were moving only about an hour away from Miami. But Lantana seemed like the perfect place for both of them, promising relaxation, opportunities, and a new adventure. And they don't skimp when it comes to apartments in Florida. They have so many amenities, not like here, where I didn't even get a refrigerator when I moved in to my first apartment. And Runaway Bay in Lantana was no different. They had the large closets, the spacious rooms, the patio out back, and their apartment was on the first floor. So depending on where their unit was, their back door could have led right out to a lake where residents could enjoy boating, kayaking, paddleboarding, fishing, and more from their own backyard.
Plus, if the lake wasn't your thing, the pool with its large deck was perfect for relaxing and working on your tan. There was even a pedestrian bridge that led from the pool area over to a walking path and more apartment buildings on the other side.
Yeah, and I saw that and I thought it was really nice. And they had a dog park and a fountain in the lake that I can just imagine the fountain water cascading on the top of that lake. I love that sound. It's so calming. It even had its own little tiny beach with hammocks and beach chairs. And I also wanted to point out they had a tennis court there. So that was another big reason why they moved to Runaway Bay. And the name itself kind of made me laugh a little bit because even though they weren't technically running away, they were kind of getting away, escaping their life in Connecticut. So I found that to be kind of ironic. It was resort living at its finest, a big change for both of them.
And they definitely didn't make this decision in a hurry. They took their time and carefully looked at all aspects of the Lantana area, like how close it was to schools, healthcare facilities, job opportunities, and recreational activities. Rita and Lisa even thought of the potential downsides of living in Lantana.
Of course, they were weighing the pros and cons, and like many places, there were drawbacks.
One was the cost of living. Plus, considering that Lantana is a small residential community, it had limited job opportunities. One significant consideration for Rita and Lisa as they weighed in the idea of moving to Lantana, Florida, was the area's vulnerability to hurricanes. As Kimbyr explained, these powerful tropical storms develop over warm ocean waters and can bring devastating winds, torrential rain, and storm surges that threaten life and property. South Florida, particularly Lantana, with its coastal location near the Atlantic Ocean, is susceptible to these storms during the hurricane season, which runs from June all the way to November, sometimes even longer. The potential for destruction, ranging from flooding to severe wind damage, was a very important factor to contemplate. Although Florida's coastal communities often have measures in place to prepare for and mitigate hurricane impacts, the risk of facing such storms is an ongoing concern. For Rita and Lisa, this meant considering how their safety, day-to-day life, and the overall sense of security might be affected by this natural hazard.
You know, being from Florida, I've never really thought about what it would be like to think about moving to Florida, but all of those things make perfect sense to me. Because I'm like, wow, people would have to think about the fact that they have this long hurricane season all throughout like the summer and into the fall. I never even thought of that. But another thing a lot of people don't take into account is that hurricanes can have a profound impact on the local economy, meaning that your job might be shut down, and that means you won't be getting paid. So understanding these potential impacts was essential for Rita and Lisa because they were evaluating the benefits and the risks of relocating to a region known for its beauty, but also its powerful storms. But ultimately, the pros outweighed the cons, and Lisa and Rita settled on Runaway Bay in Lantana. But they still decided to fly to Florida and thoroughly explore the city before making any final decisions. They booked a flight and they embarked on a 2-week adventure to immerse themselves in the South Florida culture. They were actually staying with Rita's brother at the time and his wife, and they showed them all around the city. It was a dream vacation. They did it all. They visited various landmarks and attractions, strolled along the city's picturesque beaches, and toured the apartment complex. The 2 weeks that Rita and Lisa spent in Lantana went by in the blink of an eye. Each day brought new experiences, new friendships, and a deeper connection to the city. Each day brought new experiences, new friendships, and a deeper connection to the city and its unique vibe, and they could not wait to move.
As soon as they got back to Connecticut, they started packing up all their belongings and getting ready to move to Lantana, excited for this new chapter. But their excitement was quickly met with concern from their family. Relatives strongly opposed the idea of them moving so far away, to a place so different from Torrington. They knew that Rita had often struggled with low self-esteem, and she also depended on her ex-husband James for support in many areas of her life. This reliance made them worry that she might face serious challenges starting over in a new state without the familiar support system she'd always leaned on. Even though Rita was hardworking, managing or balancing her finances wasn't her strong suit, so the family questioned whether she and Lisa would be able to thrive on their own in Florida.
I do understand their concern. They had been married for a long time. They were young when they met. But my family did the exact same thing to me when I moved to California with Shyla. When she was only 1, I heard it all. I heard you'll never make it. You'll never find a job. There's gangs there. The list went on. I think many people are also set in their ways and they don't have the courage to pack up and move to a new place. I think loved ones mean well, but usually their fears aren't warranted. But knowing what ends up happening in this case, maybe they were.
Despite the many doubts and concerns voiced by her family, Rita stayed determined to make the move. When it was finally time to pack up their lives and head to Lantana, Rita and Lisa were grateful for the support of Rita's brother Thomas and his wife Karen.
Right, they had family there too, so it's not like they were going there entirely on their own.
Right, Thomas and Karen even took the responsibility of driving Rita and Lisa from Connecticut to Florida with all their belongings.
It wasn't long before they arrived safely at their new home in Lantana, ready to start the next chapter of their lives. Mother and daughter settled into their first floor, 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartment at Runaway Bay with a monthly rent of $550. That's an equivalent to $1,200 today. So this wasn't cheap. It was more of a luxury complex, but it was well worth it, especially because of the tennis court there. Lisa could practice on the tennis court and compete in club games, and she took full advantage of that, dedicating countless hours to practicing and refining her game. But when she wasn't on the court, Lisa enjoyed basking in the sun and driving her sports car. She just got a brand new red Honda CRX. Her next goal was to enroll at the Florida Culinary Institute.
Lisa got a part-time job at Charlie's Crab, a popular restaurant in Palm Beach, to help support herself and her mom. She was determined to contribute to the household and took pride in juggling work, tennis, and her studies. Rita, just as hardworking, found a job as a cashier at Walmart in the nearby Delray Beach.
There's always a Walmart. They were settling into their new life. They even adopted 2 cats named Doc and Freddie, who became cherished members of their little family. Rita and Lisa also prioritized attending church at the First Assembly of God in Boca Raton. Things were great for the pair. they would have never had a reason to believe their lives were close to coming to an end. It's truly frightening.
By early 1992, they had been living in Lantana for about 6 months, and it was time for Lisa to start her journey toward becoming a chef. To do that, she needed to learn to drive on I-95 to get from their apartment to where she needed to go. This turned out to be a challenge. Fortunately, her uncle's wife, Karen, would drive with her support until Lisa felt confident enough to do it on her own.
Yeah, I remember Clueless when she gets on the freeway for the first time and she's like, I'm on the freeway. I mean, I-95 is pretty scary. There's so many crashes on there. When I moved from there to here, I was like, there's hardly any crashes here.
I remember one time I had to back up on the freeway because I missed that turn.
No, you can't do that.
Oh, yeah, I did. And it was, the traffic in Miami.
You're the reason why cars get in crashes. You realize that, right? He's the reason. Things were really coming together. Lisa's life was just getting started, and Rita was finally able to enjoy some free time to herself. She'd raised her children, and now it was time for a little more independence. By the summer, in August of 1992, mother and daughter had been in Lantana for just over a year. So let's move to the night of August 21st. That night, Lisa had a date. Well, kind of. She and one of her coworkers, David Blakesley, they had formed a bond with one another from Charlie's Crab, and they were going back to their workplace that night as customers to celebrate Lisa's belated 20th birthday. Although her actual birthday was July 2nd, coordinating their schedules had been difficult, so this evening was a special opportunity to celebrate together. David worked as a cook at the restaurant, and he met up with Lisa around 8 o'clock that night.
Over the past few months, Lisa and David had already been on a couple outings. However, this night was different. It was their first official date. Once at Charlie's Crab, Lisa ordered the pasta primavera, a good choice, while David opted for the paella. They chatted the entire time, discussing Lisa's recent purchase of her car, her love for tennis, and how much she enjoyed living in Florida. The evening was filled with light-hearted conversation and the shared excitement about their new relationship.
Stan Ostrowski, a fellow server at Charlie's Crab and a coworker to both David and Lisa, came over to their table during dinner for a quick chat. And during their brief conversation, Lisa and Stan made casual plans to play tennis together the next morning. Now, later in the evening, around 10:30 p.m. now, David walked Lisa to her car. David's car was parked in the Charlie's Crab lot, while Lisa's was parked about half a block north along the street, probably because it's brand new and she didn't want to park it near other cars. I remember doing that when I first got a car. When they arrived at Lisa's car, the two hugged goodbye, and before stepping into her car, Lisa smiled and told David she would see him tomorrow at work the next day. Neither one of them could have imagined that this moment would actually be their final goodbye. You just do not know. That whole week, residents were watching and waiting and trying to determine whether Hurricane Andrew would cross their path. Initially, it was predicted to make landfall near Jupiter, Florida, which is about an hour away from Rita and Lisa, and with wind speeds of 105 miles per hour. It wasn't supposed to hit until August 25th. However, the storm's strength and speed were underestimated, and it eventually made landfall in South Florida, and it would pass right over Lantana. But they still had a few days to prepare.
By the next evening, August 22nd, around 7 p.m., Rita's brother Thomas got a call from a concerned coworker at the Walmart in Delray Beach. They told him Rita hadn't shown up for her shift and hadn't called in sick, which was very out of her character. When Thomas tried to reach both Rita and Lisa by phone and couldn't get through, he knew something was wrong and decided to head over to their apartment to check on them. The storm was approaching, and the weather had already started turning bad, adding to his worry that they might be in trouble. Thomas and Karen made the short 10-minute drive to Runway Bay. During the drive, Thomas kept his concerns to himself, not wanting to alarm Karen, but deep down, he felt something terrible had happened. He hoped that when they arrived, they wouldn't see Rita's car outside, but when they pulled up, there it was. His heart sank. He knew that if Rita were home and everything was fine, she would have answered his calls. Something wasn't right.
I'm telling you, those gut feelings can be real. And Thomas ran through a list of possible explanations for Rita not picking up her phone, but her car still being there. Maybe she was asleep because her alarm failed to wake her up. But then why wouldn't Lisa answer the phone? Where was she? Perhaps they lost track of time and they got caught up doing some mother-daughter activity. Maybe they were cooking or baking. But then his thoughts turned darker. What if Rita had slipped in the shower and she fell and it left her unable to move? And she was just lying there waiting for help to arrive. As he considered each possibility, he tried to calm his anxiety. After all, each scenario suggested that she was safe, or at least she'd be okay. But there was one thought, dark and persistent, that he couldn't shake. What if Rita was dead? He knocked on the front door, and nobody answered. His anxiety was increasing as he used his spare key to unlock the door.
As soon as Thomas opened the door and peered into the living room, he could tell that something terrible had occurred inside. There were items scattered all across the floor, and in a panic, he quickly scanned the apartment, and as his eyes landed on the floor of the hallway that led to the primary bedroom, he noticed his sister's legs protruding from the doorway. When his wife Karen reached the front door to come inside, Thomas held out his hand to stop her. He knew that whatever happened inside this apartment, it was something that Karen shouldn't see. As he proceeded to Rita's room, he discovered a horrific scene.
It was nothing that anyone should have witnessed, especially a family member. Years in the military had exposed Thomas to death in ways that few could understand. He'd seen the aftermath of combat, the harsh realities of war, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The sight before him defied any sense of familiarity or resilience that he built over the years. The grisly scene overwhelmed him, and the wave of shock came over him. As soon as Thomas realized that both his niece and his sister were most likely dead, he rushed out of his sister's apartment, grabbed his wife, and they went to go get help.
That night, as everyone in South Florida was bracing for the major hurricane, Thomas's 911 call came into the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. He explained that he had gone to his sister's apartment to check on her and discovered that both she and her daughter were dead inside. Within minutes, officers arrived at the scene, including Detective Gary Martin, who was leading the case, and criminal analyst Kendra Scalise.
It didn't take long for them to realize that a murder had taken place. There was nothing natural about what happened to Rita and Lisa, not at all.
Before going further to observe and document what they'd found inside, they secured the perimeter with crime scene tape and secured the area despite Thomas seeing the overwhelming amount of blood and chaos inside. He desperately asked the officer, "Are they dead?" The officer turned to him bluntly and replied, "Oh yeah," before abruptly walking away, leaving Thomas devastated.
That is so insensitive. Oh yeah. Jeez, I mean, how heartbreaking is that? And you would play that over and over again in your head. If I heard something like that, I know I would.
Yeah, apparently. And, when officers are at the scene as something as gruesome as this one, they get tunnel vision, using every bit of their focus to piece together what happened. I guess that means sometimes their usual sensitivities take the back seat. The first thing detectives noticed was that there were no signs of forced entry. The sliding glass door was closed and locked. And when Thomas arrived, the bottom doorknob on the front door was locked, but the deadbolt wasn't.
Now that's interesting because it suggested the killer took the time to engage the lock on the knob before they left.
They did a quick walkthrough, but they noticed that this was a complex crime scene. With the storm approaching, they were nervous about how much damage it could possibly do. They could lose everything. The apartment could flood, winds could knock down walls or tear the roof off of the building. Evidence could easily be destroyed. And with that, they may never solve this case, so they decided before they collected any evidence that they'd grab a video camera and document the entire apartment the way it was initially examined.
That was a really great idea, and it also gives us the opportunity to see parts of the scene, blurred, of course. But I think it's customary nowadays, especially with the fact that officers wear body cams. But back then, this wasn't something they did typically. So upon entering, they could clearly see a struggle occurred in the living room. There's a light-colored cream sofa in the middle of the room, and they can see things scattered on the floor right in front of that couch. It was a mess. They took note of grocery bags on the floor. It appeared there were items still inside. Like one or both of these women had come through the door and been ambushed before they had a chance to even put down the bags.
Exactly. There was a takeout container on the floor near the couch. The ones with the kind of silver foil bottom and white paper lids?
I know exactly the kind you're talking about, and we do have picture and video of this. There were also maybe French fries or something lying around like they had flown out of the container in a forceful struggle. And in the same room, a Nintendo gaming system was on the floor. And I think that's the first time I've ever seen one of those in a case that we've done, but this was the early 90s. Moving on to the kitchen, they noticed something pretty peculiar. All the cabinets were open, like someone was searching for something, but it didn't look like anything was taken out of the cabinets or that the house was ransacked. Moving on to the primary bedroom, where Thomas said that he saw the two deceased individuals, Rita and Lisa.
There was blood in multiple places all around the room, on the walls, the window blinds, the bed, and the floor. Investigators noticed right away that the body of an adult female lying face down just beyond the threshold of the door to the bedroom, between the end of the bed and the dresser. She was fully clothed, dressed in her cotton nightgown, and had an obvious gunshot wound to the back of her head. Her arms were straight up beyond her head. What stood out to the investigators were the color of Rita's arms and hands. They were two different colors, her arms being very pale and her hands giving a reddish purple tint to them. Upon closer inspection, they realized they were marks on Rita's wrist, indicating that at one point she might have been tied up, but the ligature was no longer present. Above Rita's head and to the left, right under the end of the bed, was a pool of blood on top of a couple articles of clothing. At first, it looked like a very peculiar spot for blood to be, but as they looked straight up from that point, they noticed a bigger pool on top of the bed and realized it had come from Lisa.
Lisa was lying face up on the bed, and she was posed in a very graphic manner. Her legs had been purposely spread apart. She was fully unclothed, and there was a pillow from the bed over her face, almost hiding it from view. The investigators knew the killer had done this on purpose because this was not the position that Lisa had died in. Remember that pool of blood on the bed that had dripped onto the floor next to Rita's body? Well, Lisa had actually been face down, sprawled across the bed diagonally from the headboard, with her head almost hanging off the right side of the bed when she had been shot, also in the back of the head. And she must have been lying there for quite a long time for that large pool of blood to form. But sometime later, the killer turned her over and purposely posed her body, almost to humiliate and degrade her. That is truly sickening and evil. She was only 20 years old. She just turned 20 years old. Her hands, which had been positioned underneath her hip area on both sides, also had marks that indicated that she too had been tied up. It was clear that she put up a fight with her killer. She had bruises all over her body, particularly on her legs, probably from kicking her killer. And it was clear that she had also been violated. There was so much evidence in this room. It was going to take them hours to document, collect, and even analyze, so they could form a theory about why this mother and daughter were killed. But what was so sad was that they'd both been tied up and tortured before they were killed, so one of them must have watched the other one die.
Investigators don't usually rush through examining a crime scene, but Hurricane Andrew was set to make landfall within the next 48 hours.
And you know what they say, the first 48 hours are the most crucial in an investigation. So they were rushing. They were trying to document as many things as possible just in case anything ended up being destroyed.
Things they noted included a pillow that clearly matched the others from the living room couch. It was now lying on the bed near Lisa's body, and the two distinct gunshot holes through it.
Yeah, and this was done to silence the noise from the firearm.
On the bed, investigators found a bloody fingerprint on the bedsheet and several hairs that didn't seem to match Rita or Lisa's. To the left of the bed, on the floor, there were a few tennis balls and some decorative pillows scattered around, with what appeared to be another grocery bag lying underneath them. A small glass picture frame had fallen from the bedside table, and an open purse sat on the dresser. One odd detail was that a kitchen knife was on the bathroom counter next to a hairbrush, which seemed completely out of place. Although no weapon was found, a .22 caliber shell casing were discovered at the scene.
They also took note of things in the living room. The 19-inch TV was missing from its stand. There was an obvious void where it had been sitting with the outline of dust to prove it, and the cords were dangling. Cords that once went to that Nintendo, which was still there, but also a VCR, which was gone. So the killer had taken items from the apartment. Investigators wonder if this had been a robbery gone wrong. Maybe the thief was confronted by Rita and Lisa, and he was caught off guard. But there were a lot of questions.
Like, where was Lisa's brand new car?
Oh yeah, her uncle let them know that it was not in its location where it was usually parked right in front of the apartment. And I mean, the TV and the VCR, they weren't cheap items, but the car was definitely worth something, so that stood out. At this point, investigators are running with a few different theories about what could have happened, but they had to keep searching for more clues. However, their next priority is to transport the bodies to the medical examiner's office. Here's a couple more interesting observations they made. There were 4 smoked cigarette butts found in random places all around the apartment, and a 5th was underneath Rita's body. They were Salem brand cigarettes, but the thing is, Neither Lisa or Rita were smokers, so these were not their cigarettes. And I'm not a smoker. I've never smoked cigarettes, but I know from being around people who do smoke that it takes a while to smoke a whole cigarette. You used to smoke.
Mm-hmm.
How long do you think it typically takes you to smoke one cigarette?
I'd say maybe about 10 minutes. It's hard to say. It depends on what I was doing when I was smoking.
I did Google it because I didn't know, and it said that it was about 6 minutes. So considering there were 5 of them, that's at least 30 minutes that this man, this monster, hung around. And I doubt he was smoking before killing these women. So just think about that for a minute. He's hanging around for at least 30 minutes, probably more, smoking cigarettes, stealing a TV, a VCR, opening kitchen cabinets, maybe looking through other places in the apartment, and then driving away in Lisa's new car. And not only that, he put out his lit cigarettes all over the carpet. Like he would just put it down, smush it right into the carpet. That's really weird. He even put one out right on top of the takeout container. And that just bothered me, knowing that he violated Lisa, killed both of these women, had no concern at all for this home, nothing. It was just sickening. And I mean, what can I expect? A respectful killer? No. But putting out those cigarettes like that just gives the investigators more insight into his mindset, who he was. It also gives them actual DNA. And the hair that they collected might too if it had roots. So it's actually a good thing that this a-hole left his cigarettes around.
Investigators also noted that a pair of Lisa's dress shoes were neatly placed outside the front door of the apartment. This discovery made them question what time the murders had occurred. There were a few possibilities. One was that Lisa had taken off her shoes intentionally to avoid waking her mother when she came home late from her date. And along the same timeline, it was possible that when Lisa arrived home, she heard an unusual noise coming from the inside apartment and decided to take precautions by entering quietly to investigate, only to come face to face with her killer.
I can't see a young girl entering her home if she heard something that actually scared her enough to take off her shoes to avoid being heard. But it is interesting to think about what time it occurred. I'd guess after her date because, first of all, their dress shoes outside, there's a takeout food container on the floor. That alone to me suggested that Lisa arrived home to either be confronted by the killer when she entered, or he was stalking her, watching and waiting for her the moment that he could attack her as soon as she took off her shoes and entered the apartment. Then he probably ran up behind her before she had a chance to close the door and lock it, causing her to throw the food container, and a struggle ensued, which probably caused Rita to wake up and to come out there if she was awake because she was in her nightgown. So that indicates to me she was going to bed before the attack.
And let's talk about those grocery bags.
Yeah, I thought about that too. And they could have been inside her car from earlier in the day. Maybe they were already in the living room. And I looked closer, and I actually don't think there's groceries inside because look, it looks like knitting yarn. At first, it did look like a grapefruit, but the outline, it looks like those spools of yarn for crocheting. And I know Rita actually liked to do that.
It definitely looks like yarn. Then the idea of Lisa arriving home after her date does make more sense.
And more theories would have to wait because officers had to notify Rita and Lisa's family members about what happened. Rita's sister-in-law, Karen, called Rita's son, Alan, to break the tragic news about his mother and sister. And it felt like the ground had been pulled out from underneath him. Just back from a 2-week deployment, Alan was totally unprepared for the devastating reality awaiting him. He was sitting all alone, and he felt an overwhelming mix of grief and disbelief. His mother and sister, the two most important people in his life, were suddenly gone, ripped away in such a brutal manner. The hours after that call were a blur. Alan sat in silence. He was weighed down by how big this loss was. It was hard for him to make sense of how his once secure world had been shattered. Alan clung to the small consolation amid the darkness, knowing that his mom and sister had spent their final year truly happy in Florida. They had found joy in their new surroundings, creating beautiful memories together. Reflecting on their lives, Alan said, quote, "If there's any consolation to this barbaric tragedy, it's that they were happy this last year," end quote. I can't imagine how much trauma he must have gone through with the military, and then now having half of his family members die at the same time.
While the investigation was ongoing, Hurricane Andrew was also drawing closer and closer to the shore. At this point, it threatened to hit Palm Beach County directly with speeds around 165 miles per hour. Forecasters warned that this storm would be the most devastating in decades, leaving destruction in its path. The approaching hurricane caused even more chaos as residents rushed to grocery stores to stock up on essentials like water, food, batteries. Electronic stores were packed with people eager to buy generators to prepare their homes for potential outages.
I remember that storm, and there was my little Italian grandmother putting masking tape on our windows. Poor thing. I guess she had no idea how powerful these hurricanes could be. We were more affected by the flooding than damaged by the wind. We got a lot of rain, and we lived on the intercoastal waterway. So, of course, the tide came up and the roads were just filled with water. But yeah, my little grandma, I remember her saying, like, hand me the tape, honey. And I was just looking at her like cross-eyed. I was only 10 and I just recently started living there when she got custody of me. So this was the first real hurricane that I'd experienced as well. So I think it took a lot of people off guard and they didn't know really how to prepare. But then later we definitely had like the shutters and boards and everything, but people didn't know what to expect. And by August 23rd, the day after Rita and Lisa were found, Lisa's Honda CRX was discovered in a parking lot of a Sam's Club.
Whoever had driven Lisa's car left her wallet on the floorboard with her driver's license face up, almost as if they wanted the car to be found. However, investigators noted that the keys were missing. They quickly started processing the car for fingerprints. The urgency to solve the case was heightened by the impending storm, which complicated everything. To make matters worse, the car was found inside a store like Sam's Club where hundreds of people were rushing around in a frenzy preparing for the hurricane. People were so focused on their own safety that stopping them for questioning was nearly impossible.
Plus, an evacuation order was in place, so that meant detectives could lose possible witnesses because they were leaving for safer locations. And after the hurricane, if they did get in touch with these potential witnesses, they may not even remember details of what went on at that time. So investigators decided to start with Lisa's coworkers at Charlie's Crab, thinking they might still be at work, and luckily they were there. When they learned about the tragic news of her and her mother's murder, the atmosphere was one of deep shock and sorrow. They had just seen her. How could she be dead? And who would have done this? Well, one person the detectives want to speak with is David, the guy who went on a date with Lisa right before she was killed. He wasn't a suspect, but he was a person of interest. He had actually already been notified about the murders. After the date, David told the police he went home and he went back out and spent the evening socializing with friends at a local nightclub. He stayed out until about 4 a.m., just enjoying his time with friends. Then when David arrived at work the following day, after his date with Lisa, he discovered that she wasn't at work and he couldn't get in touch with her. He said that days seemed to drag on and David found himself increasingly anxious and restless. After his shift, he went home, still unable to reach Lisa, and then around 7:45 p.m. that evening, the police arrived at his door and they questioned him about a half an hour before even telling him why they were there. He was shocked when he finally was informed of the tragic news. David's mouth just dropped open in disbelief. It wasn't something any of us would expect, but he had a lovely night with her the night before, and now she's gone. David was able to be cleared due to his alibi, but he was overwhelmed with guilt.
One of the most agonizing reasons for his guilt was that he felt he had failed to make sure Lisa was safe in her car before walking away that night. He left after she stepped inside, but he couldn't shake the thought that after he drove off, someone might have emerged from the shadows and forced their way into her car. This possibility gnawed at him, leaving him with an unbearable sense of responsibility for what happened. David was also tormented by the fact that he had forgotten his usual routine after a date, asking Lisa to call him once she got home safely. That weighed heavily on him. He thought he'd see her the next day, but he couldn't help wondering if, had she not called, he might have gone over to the apartment and confronted the killer before any harm came to Rita and Lisa.
Or he could have been shot. I mean, the killer was clearly unhinged. Who knows what could have happened to David? But I understand how hard that must have been for him because we all do that. We're like, oh, text me when you get home. Call me when you get home. Sometimes I fall asleep and I forget to even check if I, got a text back from someone.
After the murders, he went out and bought a gun, knowing that the killer was still on the loose. and that made him fearful that he could be targeted too, especially since he had been so close to Lisa.
I do not blame him, but soon detectives had their very first lead, and it wasn't David.
And this tip came straight from Alan, Rita's son. He called in a tip about his own father, James Bado. Alan mentioned that James didn't seem upset, as he should have been after the murders. He also pointed out the deep bitterness between his parents. James was very money-driven and resented having to pay alimony to Rita. Their divorce was recent, and James made it clear that he disagreed with the court's decision. Plus, James had life insurance for himself and Lisa, but it was payable to Rita.
Plus, when detectives reached out to James to inform him that his ex-wife and his daughter had been killed, his response struck them as really odd. He said, "Oh no, not Lisa too." And that is interesting. This made it seem as though James had prior knowledge that Rita might be in danger, and then he was surprised to discover that his daughter had been harmed as well.
It's almost like he put out a hit on his ex-wife.
That's exactly what the investigators thought. And they planned to fly James out to Florida or to fly to him for an interview. But unfortunately, Hurricane Andrew got in the middle of those plans. By this time, they only had hours before the storm hit. So they had to stay focused on what they could do around town before they were taken off the case and temporarily assigned to the Hurricane Response Task Force. Their focus switched to a neighbor at Runaway Bay.
The investigators had been going to as many units as possible since the murders, asking residents if they had any information about the victims or if they had seen or heard anything unusual in the past few days. One resident mentioned a 26-year-old guy named Gary Widmer, who lived in the apartment above Rita and Lisa.
And he also previously worked at Walmart with Rita.
Right, and at the time of the murders, Gary was unemployed, though he picked up work here and there as a tree trimmer. With his free time, he was seen often around the apartment complex and had been seen at the pool and near where Lisa played tennis. Investigators wondered if he might have been romantically interested in Lisa and if she possibly had rejected his advances. Their attention turned to Gary's vehicle, which was parked in the lot at Runaway Bay. Inside, they noticed cleaning supplies, which immediately piqued their curiosity. Detectives began to wonder if Gary had committed the murders and planned to return to clean up, but was interrupted when Thomas arrived at the scene.
And they went to question Gary, and the first thing that stood out to them was a cigarette tucked behind his ear. It was Salem brand, exactly like the ones found in the apartment. Plus, he was very agitated. He was angry when they questioned him, and he mentioned that he was friends with Rita, and it was sad about her death, but he never mentioned Lisa, which the detectives thought was odd, especially because they were closer in age. The storm was approaching, and detectives didn't have a lot of time to get things like a search warrant. So they just asked Gary, can we please look inside your apartment? But he flat out refused. So they tried to get him to give a formal statement at the station and a DNA sample, and he refused that as well. He claimed he had nothing to do with the murders and that he actually heard screams coming from the parking lot in front of their unit on the night of the 21st. If that was true, this leans more to the theory that someone followed Lisa home or was waiting for her when she arrived. But they didn't know if Gary was telling the truth, but they had to stop talking to him because he told them he retained an attorney, which he did. Plus, the investigators were pulled from the case for now. They had to head back to headquarters and begin gearing up for their emergency response to the incoming storm. And this was very frustrating for them. You know how dedicated that most investigators are to their cases. But either way, in case anyone was wondering, because I know a lot of times people worry about what happened to the animals, the two cats were found unharmed at the crime scene, and they were taken in by one of the detectives on the case, so they were safe and cared for. But the case being stalled was also hard for Alan. Although he understood why the investigation had to be set aside, he was angry. Alan didn't like the feeling that his sister and mother's murders were being put on the back burner. He wanted the case solved and the person who did it to be off the streets as soon as possible. Hurricane Andrew was one of the most devastating hurricanes in U.S. history, making landfall in South Florida on August 24th, 1992. It was a Category 5 hurricane. It caused widespread destruction and loss of life throughout the region and $27 billion in damages.
As the storm neared South Florida, residents were ordered to evacuate low-lying areas. Still, not everyone heeded these warnings, and many faced the storm's full fury. Hurricane Andrew's intense winds and storm surge inflicted severe damage on buildings and structures. Entire neighborhoods were obliterated, leaving thousands of residents homeless. The storm tore roofs apart, toppled trees, power lines, and flooded coastal communities, causing widespread destruction to homes and businesses. The devastation of Hurricane Andrew led to the deaths of at least 65 people, with many fatalities occurring in car accidents in the aftermath when power lights were down.
But after the storm subsided, 6 detectives, including the original lead detective Gary Martin, were assigned to Lisa and Rita's case. The investigation resumed, but they couldn't help the feeling as though the hurricane may have inadvertently distanced them from their suspect. He could be miles away by now. The hurricane also delayed the autopsies. What was determined wasn't much more than what the investigators had already observed. Both women had been bound by the wrists. They'd both died from a gunshot wound to the back of the head, and there was evidence that Lisa had been sexually violated and attacked. She had multiple bruises all over her body. Rita and Lisa's funeral service was held at the Robert J. Babione Funeral Home on August 28th at 7 p.m. The service was officiated from the pastor of their church, the First Assembly of God in Boca Raton, where Rita and Lisa were regular attendees. During the funeral service, Reverend Boykin delivered heartfelt eulogies honoring both of their lives. After the funeral service, Rita and Lisa were cremated, and their remains were then returned to their hometown of Torrington, Connecticut, where they were laid to rest.
With the investigation into the murders back on track, detectives refocused on Rita's ex-husband, James Bado. Alan shared his observations about the bitterness between his parents, even saying he could see his father as a potential suspect in his mother's murder. Alan mentioned that James' behavior after the killings seemed suspicious. While James appeared devastated and emotional over Lisa's death, his reaction to Rita's was entirely different, almost celebratory. Although Alan knew their divorce had been contentious, he couldn't understand why his father would express joy over his mother's death. Given that James knew how much Rita meant to Alan, this unusual behavior raised many red flags for both him and the detectives.
To investigate James further, the detectives flew from Florida to Connecticut to question him, and while detectives were in Torrington, Alan started receiving phone calls from someone who kept hanging up on him. And at the same time, Rita's brother Thomas and his wife were also receiving similar calls, and that is weird. The detectives began questioning James about his odd response when he was informed about the murders of his ex-wife and his daughter. And basically what he said is, how do you know how to react with such devastating news? Implying that there was no right or wrong way to respond in shock. The detectives then focused on establishing his whereabouts on the night of August 21st into the early morning hours of the 22nd, when they estimated the murders occurred. James stated he was in Connecticut and had an alibi, and they were able to confirm it.
However, confirming that James was not in Florida at the time didn't completely rule him out as a potential suspect. Detectives considered the possibility that James might have hired someone to carry out the murders, with Lisa possibly becoming collateral damage if she happened to be there. When presented with this theory, James was firm in denying any involvement. The investigation then shifted to a deeper look into James's background. The detectives examined his financial connections and recent activities and uncovered an intriguing detail. An associate in South Florida owed James a significant sum of money. This raised new questions about whether James might have had a deal with this person to settle the debt in exchange for carrying out the crime. After questioning James in Connecticut, the detectives returned to South Florida to continue their investigation. They interviewed James's associate, specifically asking about the involvement in a murder-for-hire plot. The associate denied any involvement, explaining that the debt had been paid off a while ago and provided proof of that. He fully cooperated, even agreeing to provide fingerprints for a comparison to the one found at the crime scene. When the forensic analyst came back, it confirmed that the associate's fingerprints didn't match. With no additional evidence to link either James or the associate to the murders, both were cleared as suspects. This left investigators at a standstill, needing to shift their focus to other leads in the pursuit for justice for Rita and Lisa.
This case would have probably gotten a lot more media attention if it hadn't been overshadowed by this hurricane. That was really frustrating because it didn't give them much to go on, and they didn't have any clues that were standing out to them. But no matter how small something was, for example, they were looking at it. And there was this guy who broke down in his car on the side of the road, and an officer went there to help him. And while they were waiting for a tow truck, this guy started discussing details about the crime that they did not remember being publicly released. But when questioned about it, he was able to provide information that he was friends with the victim's mutual friends. So he was also ruled out, but I'm just showing that they were looking for any leads. And this is exactly why sometimes they withhold information even from family members, because they need to be able to tell if a potential suspect actually knows more than someone should. But this guy was cleared. But remember that guy, Gary Widmer? Well, when they tried to follow up, he was gone without a trace. No clue where he went. But many people had left due to the storm, so they had to put this on hold again. But he was one of their potential suspects. There were hundreds of units in Runaway Bay, and each resident had to be questioned. So as they returned following the storm, one by one were interviewed. 200 in total had been at least contacted and questioned. And this is where they get an unusual lead.
Very unusual lead. One of Rita and Lisa's neighbors reported seeing a suspicious person near the apartment around 1:30 p.m. on the day of the murders. She described the man as a 5'8", medium build with messy blonde hair and about 25 years old. The issue was that time had passed and she struggled to recall specific details. However, she was adamant that this guy seemed suspicious and believed he had been connected to the crime. To help create a composite sketch, the woman agreed to be hypnotized.
As someone from Florida, that sounds like every guy walking down the street. Like any gas station go in, a guy like that's working at the desk. But that was the unusual part for me. It was the hypnosis. Because what happens next, I'm not sure I agree with. The neighbor goes under hypnosis, and afterward, they have an artist come in and they create a sketch. But what I didn't think made sense is that they put so much weight into the identification, even passing the sketch out to residents in Runaway Bay. And I think that that could lead to targeting the wrong person. Hypnosis doesn't seem reliable enough to go that far with it. And ultimately, it didn't bring them any viable leads. By September, detectives taped a segment for Crime Stoppers, and they believed by showing a reenactment of the crime on TV, they could encourage viewers to call in with tips. But again, nothing viable came out of that either. But here's what I don't agree with. Another thing I don't agree with the same situation. A year went by, and I don't understand why, but I guess they were pretty desperate for leads. But in the summer of 1993, Rita and Lisa's case was featured in the series A Current Affair. And during the episode, guess what? They show the composite sketch. It was created under hypnosis. And I don't know, that just seemed wrong. Because what if it was someone she saw from her past? It seemed unethical to me, but give me your thoughts. And it did not lead to any tips or an arrest.
I agree. And just like in one of our last cases, you might be wondering why they didn't extract DNA from the cigarette butts, which seemed like the most promising lead, or run the fingerprints through the database. The thing is, this was still the early 90s, and technology hadn't advanced to the point where they had a CODIS database like today. CODIS was just starting to become a thing, so they couldn't use it.
Yeah, there was a doctor named Cecilia Kraus, and she was the DNA analyst whose job it was to actually extract the DNA from the cigarette butts. And she wasn't even sure back then how much DNA you could get from an item like this because they didn't have anything to reference. This was all new. So what she did, we're talking about 1992 here, what she did is she put this DNA into a 20-degree freezer to preserve it until technology advanced. And I think that's a really smart move. But it was still a waiting game. But remember Gary Widmer, the tree trimming neighbor that smoked Salem's and wouldn't talk to the detectives? Well, they finally tracked him down at the morgue. Yes. In May of 1994, 2 years after the tragic murders, Gary Widmer's body was found in his Long Island, New York apartment as a result of a drug overdose. And this meant that the detectives no longer needed to get a search warrant for Gary's DNA or his fingerprints. Instead, they requested a sample from the medical examiner's office, which was now handed over to Palm Beach County Police. Officers spent 3 weeks comparing Gary's DNA and his fingerprints to the evidence at the crime scene. After 2 years and tireless detective work, the officers were confident that they were on the verge of receiving the biggest breakthrough, the one they were looking for. But unfortunately, the test results came back, revealing that Gary was not a match. Wow, all of that work, but it's necessary.
Absolutely. Then on July 15th, 1995, 3 years after the murders of Rita and Lisa, Palm Beach officers made a tragic discovery. The body of 28-year-old local Denise O'Neill was found in a canal tightly wrapped in a pink sheet. The news of another young woman being murdered nearby reignited the interest in the Bado case. The circumstances of Denise's death were eerily similar to that of Lisa's. Denise had been violated and her car had been taken and later abandoned. The most chilling similarity was that she, too, had worked at Charlie's Crab and had gone on a date the night before her death. This fueled speculation among the investigators and the public that the cases might be linked. However, the investigation into Denise O'Neill's murder ultimately took a different turn. Two young men, Luke Christopher Caballero, 21, and Quincy Brown, who was 19, were Denise's neighbors. They confessed to killing her. Despite initial hopes for a breakthrough connecting the cases, the detectives found no link between Denise's murder and the homicides of Rita and Lisa.
Their family was concerned that this murder would never be solved, and at this point, the investigators were starting to share more information with them little by little. And one of the things that let the family know, their family was concerned that this murder would never be solved. And by this point, investigators were starting to tell them even more information little by little. And one of the things they let the family know is that they thought that this was a random act of violence, which are even harder to investigate, harder to prove, and harder to solve. But they held on to hope that the DNA from the cigarette butts would ultimately come through and they would find their killer someday. And I can't imagine having to wait like that. And Dr. Krause was always checking for advances in technology. And finally, her diligence paid off. A new method had emerged, allowing them to obtain a full DNA profile from a cigarette butt. That's crazy. Just imagine you had to wait and wait. And also, I do want to mention, when someone's told that's a random act of violence, you kind of, I don't know, there's something about that that's bothersome for families because they're like, wait a minute, no, there had to be a connection. There had to be more than this. So that's how they were feeling at the time. But there were still no DNA databases, which meant that the detectives faced a significant challenge. They had to compare this new profile they just got to suspects. So they had to go out there and get hundreds of swabs from everyone and anyone they interviewed over the past few years. Coworkers, friends, relatives, the date she went on, residents of the apartment, many of which already moved away. But despite their diligence, none of the swabs matched the profile from the cigarette butts. And as more years passed and the investigation remained inactive, DNA databases such as CODIS began to be created. And because of the brutal nature of this crime, the investigators truly believed that this perpetrator would strike again or possibly had already committed another violent crime. And eventually they thought his DNA would turn up in a database. At least that's what they were counting on. Well, get this. Unbeknownst to investigators on Lisa and Rita's murder, there was another Lantana killing that occurred a year before theirs, only 9 minutes away, at a small one-story apartment building that was connected to their murders, but they didn't know that.
On December 9th, 1991, the body of a 40-year-old courthouse filing clerk, Martin Gatto, was found stabbed to death on the floor of his apartment. Martin was a dedicated worker who spent his days organizing thousands of complex divorce settlements for the Palm Beach County court system. His reliability and strong work ethic were what first alerted his coworkers that something was wrong when he didn't show up for his shift. He had only been living in his apartment for 2 years, having moved from New York and had been previously working as a salesman for Palm Beach Post. Like Lisa, Martin had just purchased a brand new car around the time he was killed. When police arrived, his car was still sitting at the carport with the windows rolled down.
Yeah, and he worked specifically in the child support division and had gotten a promotion to a computer operator who tracked down stolen and forged checks and made sure court orders for child support and visitation were kept in order so that those who owed money or violated their orders would be flagged in the system. He was really good at his job. He got over $9,000 in raises alone between the 4 years he was working for the court, which meant some people were not happy with him, the people who owed money. So what was the connection? Well, for one, the DNA. The killer who committed Rita and Lisa's murders had also killed Martin just 8 months earlier and 3 miles away.
Investigators wouldn't make this connection until much later. In 2001, 9 years after Rita and Lisa's murder, a breakthrough came during a routine check through CODIS. A manager at headquarters found a match and alerted Dr. Cecilia Krause. The DNA profile from Rita and Lisa's murder had been linked to an inmate in the Wisconsin prison. This inmate, whose name was initially not released to the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, had been incarcerated at the Green Bay Correctional Facility since 1995. 1995, just 3 years after the Bado murders.
Dr. Krause was in Orlando at a conference when she received a call on her car phone. Remember those? Those were giant bricks that stayed inside our cars in the center console. Well, all the manager at CODIS had to say was, "We got a hit," and she knew exactly what case they were referring to. Once she ran and compared the DNA, she matched it to 41-year-old James Anthony Frederick. He would have been only 32 when Rita and Lisa were murdered. Even though this was a big break, they still had a lot of work to do to prove that James was their killer. They knew identifying a suspect was the first step in the investigative process. Next, they needed to gather evidence, conduct interviews, and follow up on any leads that could connect James Frederick to the crime.
Detective Martin didn't waste any time. He flew from Florida to Wisconsin to interview James Frederick at the Green Bay Correctional Facility. During the questioning, detectives collected hair and blood samples from James to compare to the evidence collected at the crime scene. In addition to the DNA analysis on the cigarette butts, the lab technician had also analyzed DNA from the hair found in the bed where Lisa's body was discovered.
Now, initially, the DNA testing on the hair they found, they thought would be initially impossible because usually you had to have a root. The only way they used to conduct these comparisons was visually under a microscope. Can you imagine? Like, two people's hair can look exactly alike, and they used to think that was reliable, and it's not. However, the technology advanced, and in the year 2000, they introduced mitochondrial DNA testing, which offered new possibilities because now they could examine it without a nucleus, which meant the hair shaft could be identified as a match through DNA. So lab technicians were working on establishing a DNA profile from the hairs preserved from the crime scene to compare to James Frederick's. But that would take some time. But right now he was being shown pictures of Rita and Lisa and asked if he recognized either of them. He took one look at the picture of Rita and said he had no idea who she was. But then he kind of stared at the picture of Lisa as though he was trying to jog his memory. He told them that she looked familiar, but he couldn't really place where he had seen her before. I don't think that I'd be able to hold back. I would have been like, "You don't remember putting a bullet in her head?" And I know that's over the top, but this was a brutal, heinous crime. I'm sure Detective Martin put him through the ringer, but ultimately James didn't admit to anything. Plus, what reason would he have to talk? He was already serving 2 consecutive 47-year sentences for robbery and attempted murder. He shot a customer in a bar in Milwaukee that was trying to stop him from robbing a cashier. And how did they know that he wasn't just a friend who came over and smoked at Rita and Lisa's place sometime before the crime? What if the cigarettes were just scattered during the attack and he had nothing to do with them? I was curious whether they took swabs from Lisa's body, because that is something they do now, but maybe they didn't back then. I don't know, because that would have been 100% proven that he committed the violation. So then that would be even more likely that he committed the murders.
But the cigarettes weren't just scattered around. They had been burning when they were pushed into the various parts of the apartment and right into the carpet.
That's true. And that's very true. But a defense attorney could still argue that it doesn't prove murder because it doesn't.
Until DNA testing could be completed, detectives conducted a background check on James Frederick, and they discovered that he had actually been living in Lantana at the time of the murders.
Another factor that linked him to the crime. And he also had an extensive criminal history. It revealed that James had been in and out of jail since he was just a preteen. He was known for his anger and defiance. He had a number of arrests, which included charges for arson, burglary, escape, prowling, drug offenses, and even battery on an officer. James had moved to Florida while on parole from another state approximately 18 months before August 1992. And back in December of 1991, which remember was the time when Martin Bado was killed, James was arrested in Palm Beach County for cocaine possession. And once he was released, he was again in county jail for resisting arrest just a month before the killings.
Detectives received multiple accounts from individuals who described James as volatile and ruthless, with a known violent streak and a tendency to fly off the handle unpredictably. He was not someone to take lightly. When James was convicted in Wisconsin for the 1995 robberies, he even tried to attack the prosecutor and threatened to kill him. Moreover, the gun he used in those robberies was very similar to the weapon later used to kill Rita and Lisa. Despite their thorough investigative work, detectives couldn't establish any direct connection between James and Rita or Lisa. There was no evidence that suggested that they had ever interacted or that James knew them personally. However, detectives considered whether James might have been using deceptive tactics to gain access to the apartment. They knew that in a previous incident, James had worn a wig to disguise himself as a woman to enter a residence, and they wondered if he could have used a similar approach in this case.
But what exactly would that accomplish? Would he be less threatening if he was pretending to be a woman?
That's what I'm thinking.
Or it could be maybe to throw people off. Like maybe he puts on the wig so that people might see him in the vicinity and they'll think, oh, I saw a woman walking around. And then he'll put it on after. And then he walks out after committing the crime and he's disguising himself.
Detectives tracked down and interviewed the woman James had been living with and dating at the time of Rita and Lisa's murders, hoping she could shed some light on his behavior during that period. She mentioned that James was heavily involved in drug use and recounted an incident where he arrived at their home in a Honda CRX, a car that matched the description of Lisa's vehicle. According to the girlfriend, James tried to persuade her to come with him to exchange a TV and a VCR for crack cocaine. But when she declined, before he drove off, she claimed that she saw a TV and a VCR in the backseat of the car.
I mean, to me, it's pretty obvious. There's so many connections. But the detectives also questioned an old acquaintance of James who corroborated the story. The friend said that he went with James to an area where they exchanged the electronics for drugs. So more circumstantial evidence, but very incriminating. Finally, the results of the DNA on the hair came back, confirming that it was also James Frederick's. It was 1 in a quintillion chance that he was the contributor to the DNA found at the crime scene. This scientific evidence provided a strong indication that James Frederick was indeed responsible for the heinous crimes committed against Rita and Lisa. But James maintained his innocence. However, when faced with the overwhelming weight of the evidence against him, he eventually looked Detective Martin right in the eyes and said, well, I guess I'm going to Florida.
Prosecutors don't have to prove a motive, but for investigators and Rita and Lisa's family, understanding why was important. Various theories emerged about why James Frederick had killed the women, though at this point they hadn't connected him to Martin Gatto's case. Both Martin and Lisa drove flashy brand new cars, which could attract a criminal looking to rob someone. One theory was that James targeted people he believed had money because he was trying to support his crack habit.
But what puzzled detectives was the violation of Lisa. If James was indeed solely there to rob the victims, why did he resort to not only violating Lisa, but killing both women and then posing Lisa's body the way he did? That took time and effort and extra work. They were unable to comprehend the rationale behind such a brutal act, as it seemed completely at odds with the goal of just robbing someone. The sexual aspect is sadistic. It's driven by more of a personal gratification and sometimes done to terrorize victims. It's also usually more premeditated, but not always. There are indeed men who in the moment see a woman and decide to force themselves on her, so we do not know. Maybe he did it because he could. Even if it was just a robbery, if he was already there, maybe he took advantage of the fact that he had a gun, he could overpower them, and that is so sad. I mean, it was 100% him. There's no doubt about that. So my theory was he saw this beautiful young woman getting out of her car. He probably cased that area. Maybe he was there earlier in the day. Maybe he was the guy that woman under hypnosis saw. Who knows? But I would guess that it was her flashy car that made him think she had money. And he pushed her into that apartment, not realizing that her mom would be there. I assume Rita came out when she heard the commotion and she probably started screaming. They were both bound at one point, which leads me to believe that first, he probably was going to just rob them. He probably tied them up just so that they would not make noise. Because y'all don't know this yet, but we're going to find more information about what he did to Martin. He was like gagged, bound. So clearly he doesn't want his victims to make noise. And that's when he probably started putting the TV and VCR into the car. Something made him decide to go through with the violation. The fact that Rita was lying with her head facing the bedroom makes me believe that they were initially tied up in the living room and probably sitting on the couch where all the commotion was, and that he brought them into the bedroom, sat Lisa on the bed, shot the mom in the head, and proceeded to violate Lisa in the exact position she was initially in when she was shot. I don't know why he turned her over, though. I just think he's a sick bastard. If y'all have any theories, let us know, because the only person that's going to know is James. And he claims he has no memory of this entire situation because he was on drugs.
Finally, in April 2003, James Frederick was indicted on 2 counts of capital murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and 1 count of sexual battery. Since Wisconsin didn't have the death penalty, but Florida did, Wisconsin refused to extradite James unless Florida agreed to take the death penalty off the table.
And I was like, why do they care? But each state has their own laws, and Wisconsin owns James. But luckily, the 2 governors made a deal. No death penalty, so they allowed James to be extradited to Florida to stand trial. Rita and Lisa's family members were filled with a range of emotions, as you can imagine, after James Frederick was arrested. At least they knew that somebody was going to be held responsible, and they weren't just going to be waiting around for more answers. He ended up taking a plea deal on November 28, 2005. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder with a firearm and kidnapping. As part of the deal, though, the state dropped the charges of grand theft and the sexually related crime, which made me mad because those were the things he did to Lisa. I mean, yes, the killing, but that just bothered me. I really wanted him to take accountability for what he did. But all he did was make excuses. He said society was to blame. In the end, the judge sentenced James to 2 consecutive life sentences.
It wasn't until October 2006 that James Frederick's DNA was matched to the murder of Martin Gatto. At that point, James was still serving his term in Wisconsin before starting his life sentence in Florida, so he had to be extradited back to Florida again. Through their investigations, detectives were able to connect James and Martin as acquaintances, though James never admitted to knowing Martin or being at his apartment. However, they tied him to the scene with 90 DNA samples and 38 pieces of evidence, including a cigarette butt. Martin had been bound, he'd been gagged, and James stabbed Martin to death in what was described as a robbery gone wrong. He had been seen at a local bar called Roosters on December 8th, and Martin's body was discovered the next day. Just like in Rita and Lisa's case, there were no signs of forced entry, and a few items, including a television, had been taken from the apartment. Ultimately, James was never put on trial for Martin's murder because he was already serving a life sentence.
But for the sake of that person's family and their memory, I think that every criminal needs to be tried for their crimes they commit, regardless of whether they're already there for life, because then it diminishes the responsibility and the impact that that murder had. I mean, if you were Martin's family and they're just like, oh, we're going to let it go because he's already serving a life sentence. But I would want a legal document that said, you did this to my loved one. That's what I think matters. But what truly mattered in this case was that he was behind bars. But what we know from these cases is that Martin and Lisa were both driving nice cars. So James most likely did the exact same thing. He followed Martin home and then into his apartment. But stabbing someone is a much more personal crime. However, if James followed him from the bar, maybe he didn't have a gun on him and it was a spur-of-the-moment decision because he wanted drugs. I hate it when we don't know exactly why someone did what they did, but I don't think we ever will because we cannot think like a killer. We can't think the same way. But random killings scare the hell out of me.
His want and need of drugs that caused him to do all this.
Yeah, it's just sad. I mean, clearly not thinking at all because you're in that drug-induced state of mind. I mean, crack, that's what he was doing, crack cocaine. So it's like, who knows what you're thinking?
Well, thank you all for being here for Rita and Lisa's story.
We really do appreciate it. And we will see you in our next video. Bye.